The auctioneer's voice carried over the heads of 40 men, like a blade looking for skin. Lila hadn't slept in 3 days. She could feel it in the roots of her teeth, in the way her knees kept wanting to fold underneath her. She stood on the raw pine platform in the center of Coldwater's Main Street, holding her daughter against her chest, the way you hold the last thing you own in the world, which, as of that morning, was exactly what Nettie was. The sun was wrong for October. It pressed down flat and merciless, and the crowd of men below the platform smelled of horses and dried sweat, and the particular kind of cruelty that comes from men who have already decided something. Depths of the late Conrad Marsh. The auctioneer bellowed, his voice slick with practiced indifference, totaling $61 to Garfield's supply and $14 to the county for the removal of the body. The widow Lila Marsh and her child are offered for a term of bound labor, not to exceed 18 months, to satisfy the debt in full. Bound labor. That was what they were calling it now. Lila kept her eyes on a fixed point somewhere above the crowd's heads, a loose shutter on the feed store across the street. She focused on it. If she looked at any of the faces below her, she would start shaking in a way she wouldn't be able to stop. Conrad had been drunk when he borrowed the first 20, drunk when he borrowed the rest, drunk the morning he rode his horse into a ravine on the South Trail and broke his own neck and left her alone with a 14-month-old girl, 31 cents in a cracked sugar bowl, and $61 of debt she'd known nothing about until the notice arrived, nailed to her door. $5, someone called out. From the left side of the crowd. It was Fenwick. She recognized the voice without looking. He ran the roadhouse at the edge of town, a low-slung building of grey wood that reeked of lye soap and old blood. She'd heard what happened to the women who worked there. Everybody had. Nettie shifted against her chest, making a small bird-like sound of discomfort. Lila pressed her lips to the crown of her daughter's head and breathed in soap, milk, the particular sweetness that babies carry that no one can quite describe and that breaks your heart every single time. $8, another voice answered. Lila's grip tightened. She didn't hear the horse at first. The crowd was too loud, and the blood rushing in her ears was louder. She heard Dyson's first, the way it spread outward from somewhere behind, the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, men stepping back, voices cutting off mid-syllable. Then she saw him. He rode out of the sun, which seemed intentional somehow, though she would later think that was just the angle of the street. He was on a black mare, with a white striped nose, leading 2 loaded mules behind her. He had the look of a man who had come down from somewhere high and cold, and wasn't entirely comfortable at lower elevation, like the air was the wrong weight for his lungs. He was enormous, wide through the shoulder and chest in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with years of heavy labor. His coat was elk hide, dark with age, and his face was the kind of face that mountains make out of men who live on them long enough, angular, deeply weathered, a jaw like the edge of a granite ledge. He hadn't shaved in what looked like the better part of a month. He walked his horse to the edge of the platform and stopped. He didn't look at Lila. He looked at the auctioneer. "What's the total?" he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low and flat, and it cut through the square the way cold air cuts through a cracked window. You don't see it coming, but you feel it everywhere at once. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, the auction is in progress. If you'd like to place a bid." "The total debt," the man repeated. "What does she owe?" $75 even, with the county's handling fee. The man reached into the interior of his coat without hurrying. He pulled out a leather pouch, the worn, sweat-dark kind that spent years on a man's body before it became familiar. He set it on the edge of the platform with a sound like a door closing. $80, he said, "for the debt, the fee, and the auctioneer's trouble." The square went so quiet Lila could hear the shutter on the feed store creaking in the wind. "Keep the change," he added, already turning his horse. Fenwick pushed forward from the edge of the crowd, his face red, Now hold on, that ain't how this works. The woman is bound to whoever wins the bidding, and I got 8 on the table." The man on the black mare looked at Fenwick for exactly 2 seconds. There was nothing threatening in his expression. There was simply nothing in his expression at all, which was somehow worse. "The debt is cleared," the man said. "She's not bound to anyone." He looked at the auctioneer. "Is the debt cleared?" The auctioneer had already pulled the leather pouch into his lap and was weighing it in his hands. He swallowed. "Debt is cleared," he muttered. The man dismounted. He tied the mare to the post at the platform's base and looked up at Lila for the first time. She had expected triumph, or pity, or the worst thing, ownership, the look that said she'd simply changed hands. She didn't see any of those things. He looked at her the way a man looks at a situation that needs managing. Practical, almost tired. "Come down," he said. "Can you walk?" "Yes," Lila said, though her legs told a different story when she tried the steps. She made it down without falling, which she counted as a victory. "You have things," he said. "No." He looked at her, looked at Nettie. He exhaled through his nose, a sound like wind moving through a gap in the rocks, and turned back to his horse without further comment. "My name is Lila," she said to his back. He was already checking the cinch on the mare's saddle. "Cutter," he said. That was all. His name, she would later learn, was Reuben Cutter, but no one called him Reuben, and nobody called him anything more than once. He rode. She walked beside the horse, because she refused to ask him to let her ride, and because Nettie was heavy against her chest, and because her legs were doing exactly what she'd known they would do, which was threatening to give out. On the 2nd mile. He didn't offer, and she didn't ask, and they were 2 miles out of Coldwater before he stopped the mare and looked down at her. "Get on," he said. "You're going to drop the baby." "I'm not going to drop her. Your left knee's been buckling every 4th step since we left town." Lila looked at him. He was staring at the trail ahead with the expression of a man who had said a thing and intended to say it only once. She got on the horse. He walked. She rode, which felt entirely backward, but Cutter seemed unbothered by it. He set a pace that was steady and relentless, moving up the switchbacks of the North Trail with the particular efficiency of someone who had done this climb several hundred times and stopped noticing it. The valley fell away behind them. The scrubby flatland oak gave way to ponderosa pine, to fir, to stands of aspen that flickered silver-white in the autumn light. The air thinned and sharpened. Lila breathed it in and felt something in her chest loosen very slightly, like a fist that had been clenched for 3 days finally letting go of one finger. Nettie was watching Cutter with the solemn, unblinking attention that small children direct at things they find fascinating and slightly alarming. "She hungry?" Cutter said, still not looking back. "She's all right for now." He stopped at a thin trickle of a creek where it crossed the trail, letting the mare drink. He unpacked one of the mules without a word and produced from a canvas saddlebag a piece of dried jerky and a small round of hardtack. He held them up to Lila. "Jerky first," he said. "Chew it soft, give her the juice and the softer bits. Hardtack for you. There's water in the canteen." Lila took them. She looked at him, the flat, practical expression, the total absence of performance. He wasn't being kind, or so he seemed to want her to think. He was solving a problem. "Thank you," she said. "Mountain lion territory above the tree line," he said, turning back to the mule. "Crying carries. Better she's fed." Lila bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling and chewed the jerky. The cabin sat backed against a granite outcrop at 8,000 feet, hunkered into the rock like it had grown there, like the mountain had simply pushed it up from underneath. It was single room, built of unpeeled logs, the color of old bone, with a sod roof and a lean-to on the north side for the animals. No curtains, no flower boxes, no evidence whatsoever that any woman had ever been within half a mile of the place. It smelled like cold ash and pine pitch and old leather, and the particular concentrated solitude of a man who had lived alone long enough that the loneliness had compressed into something hard and self-sustaining like coal. Cutter pushed the door open and stepped back. He didn't gesture inside. He simply created a space for her to go in, she was beginning to understand how he communicated most things. Inside, an iron stove in the center of the floor, dark with use, a table of split pine logs, rough as the man who'd made it, a single iron-framed bed in the far corner, buried under a pile of elk and bear hides. 2 rifles on the wall above it, plus a shotgun and a row of steel traps hanging like dark, toothy ornaments, 1 oil lamp, 1 wooden stool. Lila stood in the doorway with Nettie pressed against her heart and looked at the room. She had grown up in a 2-room house in eastern Missouri. She had moved to Conrad's claim in Colorado Territory, with hope she now recognized as a kind of willful blindness. She had slept the last 4 nights on the plank floor of a borrowed room, with nothing between herself and the wood but a thin wool blankets. This was not the worst place she had ever been. Fire needs starting, Cutter said from behind her. Wood's by the door. Stove's temperamental. Open the bottom vent first, then the top, or it'll smoke. He went back outside without another word to deal with the animals. She started the fire. It took her 4 tries with the bottom vent, 3 with the top, and the stove smoked at her for a full 2 minutes before it caught. But it caught. The iron began to tick and pop as it heated, and the cold began to pull back from the corners of the room. And Lila sat on the wooden stool with Nettie in her lap and let herself feel exactly 1 moment of something close to relief, before she set it aside and began looking around the room for what she could do. When Cutter came back in, she had found the oats in the burlap sack hanging from the rafter, had mashed them thin over the stove with water from the bucket, had fed Nettie 3 careful spoonfuls, and was feeding her a 4th. He stood in the doorway and looked at this scene without expression. The sack was hung so mice couldn't get in, he said. Not accusatory, informational. I replaced the knot, Lila said, and I left the loop longer than it was, in case you need to lower it without a ladder. A long pause. Go ahead and eat some yourself, he said. Finally, walking past her to the stove, he made coffee from grounds so dark and coarse they were almost gravel, boiled in a dented tin pot. He poured a cup and set it at the edge of the table near her without comment. He took his own cup and stood by the stove, drinking it with the same grim efficiency he seemed to apply to everything. I'm not staying on as your bound labor, Lila said. I want you to understand that. Cutter looked at her over the rim of his cup. I know what you paid, she said, and I don't know why you paid it, and I won't pretend I'm not grateful, but I'm not a servant. Didn't say you were. Then what am I doing here? He drank his coffee. He looked at the wall. Surviving, he said finally. Same as everything else on this mountain. That's not an answer. He met her eyes. His were dark, set deep under a heavy brow, and very direct in a way that made her want to look away, though she didn't. I don't like cold water, he said. I don't like men who use law as a whip. I don't like standing in a crowd watching something wrong happen when I have $80 and a horse. He paused. You need a place to get through the winter. I've got one. That's all this is. And next spring. Next spring, he said. Is next spring. He turned away and began assembling something from the provisions in the mule packs, and that was the end of the conversation, though Lila sat with it for a long time afterward, turning it over the way you turn a rock to see what's living underneath. He slept in the lean-to with the animals that night. He made it clear this was his choice, by the brisk, unsentimental way. He gathered his bedroll and walked out the door, and by the fact that he left, without giving her the opportunity to object. She lay in the bed under 3 layers of bear hide with Nettie warm against her side, and listened to the wind quarrel with the trees outside, and thought about the particular quality of this man who spent his $80 and his 1 act of visible emotion, and then retreated back into stone. She didn't sleep much. But she slept. The days found their shape. Cutter left at dawn to check his trap lines and returned in the late afternoon with game. Snowshoe hare, sometimes a pheasant, once a young mule deer whose dressing he did outside and quickly, before Lila could offer to help. He cut wood in great violent swings that she could hear from inside the cabin, and he repaired the chinking on the north wall where the wind had been finding its way in, and he was methodical and competent and almost entirely silent. Lila was not silent. She reorganized the cabin's food stores because the system he'd had made no sense. She repaired 2 of the blankets where the stitching had rotted through, using a bone needle she found in the bottom of his supply box. She started a stock pot on the afternoons when they had enough meat, letting it simmer low through the day, and twice she managed biscuits in the cast-iron skillet that came out denser than she intended but edible, and Cutter ate everything she put in front of him, with the same expression of total concentration he brought to every task, which she eventually decided was the highest compliment he knew how to pay. Nettie watched him. This was the thing that undid Lila, slowly, in increments, the way her daughter watched him. Nettie had been wary of men her whole short life, which made sense because Conrad had been loud and unpredictable and smelled of things that scared small children. But she tracked Cutter with solemn brown eyes from the moment he entered the room, watching his hands especially, the way they moved with slow, deliberate precision around her, never quick, never toward her directly, always giving her room. On the 5th day, Nettie reached out from Lila's arms as Cutter walked past and grabbed his index finger in her whole fist. Cutter stopped. He looked down at the small fist wrapped around his finger. He looked at it for a long time with an expression Lila couldn't quite read, something that moved across his face and then was gone. "She's got a grip," he said. "She does." Lila agreed carefully. He stayed still until Nettie released him of her own accord. Then he walked to the stove and poured a cup of water and didn't say anything else, but his shoulders had done something different, a change so small she almost missed it, like a door that had been locked opening not all the way, but one turn of the latch. That night she found a small figure on the table, beside where Nettie slept, a rough-carved thing that might have been a horse or a deer, or some private combination of both, its legs a little lopsided, and clearly made blocky and imprecise, of a lean-to with cold hands and a hunting knife. Lila picked it up. The wood was still faintly warm. She set it back exactly where she'd found it, and went to bed without a word. The first real snow came at the end of October, like someone had thrown a switch. One morning there was frost on the grass, and by midday the sky had gone the color of hammered iron, and by dusk the world outside the cabin window had been replaced entirely by white. Cutter had prepared for it. The wood stacked high under the lean-to, the animals brought into the shelter, the chinking all repaired. He moved through the preparations with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this before, and had stopped finding it remarkable. But Nettie woke that night flushed and wrong. Lila felt it before she heard it, the particular terrible heat of a small body that has turned against itself. She had Nettie in her arms and was already moving toward the stove, when the cabin door banged open and Cutter came in from checking the animals, snow still on his coat, and stopped. He looked at them. He took in the situation with the same practical speed he brought to everything. "How long?" he said. "I just felt it. Minutes." He crossed the room in 3 strides. He crouched in front of her and pressed the back of his hand against Nettie's forehead. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Strip the extra blankets," he said, standing. "She's cooking. We need to bring the heat down, not up. She'll freeze. She'll seize if we leave the fever where it is." He was already moving to his supply box under the bed. "Trust me." She didn't know if she trusted him. She didn't know him, but his voice had a certainty in it that was different from authority. It was the certainty of someone who had made these decisions before, out here, alone, with no one else to defer to. She stripped the extra layers. He came back with a bundle of dried sage, grey-green and brittle, smelling of medicine and old snow, and a tin pot already filled with water from the bucket. He set it on the stove and crushed the leaves between his palms with the efficiency of long practice, dropping the flakes into the water. "Steam," he said, from the sage. "When it boils, you tent a blanket over her head and hold her face in the steam. It'll clear the congestion in her chest. I've seen it work." He paused. "I've seen it not work too, but I've seen it work more." Lila looked at him. "What do we do about the fever?" He produced a small piece of ice he'd chipped from the water bucket and wrapped it in a clean flour sack. "Back of the neck," he said. "Under the arms. Move it every few minutes. Don't let one spot go numb." They worked through the night. Lila held Nettie under the blanket tent and let the sage steam curl thick and sharp through the air, and she talked to her daughter in a low, steady voice. Not soothing sounds, actual words, because Nettie had always responded to words, had always turned toward them like plants turn toward light. She told her about the garden they'd had in Missouri. She told her about a yellow cat she'd known as a girl. She told her things that didn't matter, and things that mattered enormously. And she talked without stopping, because stopping felt like something she couldn't afford. Cutter moved the ice. He made no sound. He was simply there, on the other side of the blanket tent, a dark, reliable presence in the orange-lit room. And every time she glanced at him, he was watching Nettie's face with the same expression he'd had when she grabbed his finger. Something underneath the stone surface of him attending. At some point past midnight, Nettie coughed. It was a real cough, deep and wet and productive. Then another, then a long, ragged breath that cleared something, that opened something, that sounded like a door swinging wide. She cried. It was the best sound Lila had ever heard. She pressed her face into her daughter's damp hair and shook apart in total silence, because she was a woman who had learned to conduct her falling apart quietly out of long practice. After a moment, she felt a hand on her shoulder, heavy, warm, there for exactly 3 seconds, and then gone. She didn't look up. He didn't say anything, but the hand had been real, and she would not forget it. In the days after the fever, a different kind of cold moved in, the kind that doesn't arrive with drama but simply settles, permanent and absolute, dropping the mountain into a 0-degree silence that made the earlier cold feel like a memory of warmth. Cutter came back one afternoon, with a set to his jaw that told her something before he spoke. 3 men came up the South Trail while I was running the lower lines, he said. Fenwick's boys. They were asking questions at the trapper's place about whether anyone had seen a woman and a child. Lila stopped what she was doing. "They're not going to come up here," Cutter said, and his voice had the same flat certainty as when he'd told her about the fever. "I'll make sure of it." "What does that mean?" "It means I'll make sure of it." She looked at him. He was already pulling his rifle from the wall, checking the action with the quick, practiced movement of a man who had made this particular gesture 10,000 times. He shrugged his coat on. "Stay inside," he said. "Keep the bar on the door." "Cutter." He paused with his hand on the latch. "There are 3 of them," she said. He looked at her over his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I counted." He went out. She put the bar on the door. She sat at the table with Nettie in her arms and listened to the total silence of the mountain above the wind, and she waited. The shot came 40 minutes later. Then nothing. Then the sound of voices she didn't recognize, distant, and then the sound of horses departing at speed, which is a particular sound, urgent and retreating, that she hadn't thought she'd find comforting. She waited. An hour after the horses, she heard the mare's hooves on the frozen ground outside. She threw the bar back and opened the door. He was on his feet, which she noticed immediately, and then she noticed the way his left arm was held against his side, pressed flat like he was trying to hold something in place. "There was a complication," he said. The word complication was doing considerable work. She got him inside. In the lantern light, the damage was clear and ugly. A knife wound along his left ribs, 4 inches long and deep enough that the thought of it made the room tilt slightly at the edges of her vision. She didn't let the room tilt. She got him onto the floor because the bed was too high, and she got his coat and shirt off him, and she found the whiskey jug under the bed, and the curved leather needle, and the waxed sinew in the supply box, and she gathered them around her like tools. "I've never sewn a person," she said. "I've sewn leather goods and quilts. I want you to know that." "Just close it," he said, "tight as you can. Don't be cautious about it." She wasn't cautious. She talked while she sewed. Partly because it kept her hand steady, and partly because it kept him conscious. She asked him things she'd been too careful to ask before. How long had he been on this mountain? What had made him come here in the first place? Whether he'd ever thought about going somewhere else? He answered. Terse, minimal answers, but answers. 12 years. A war he didn't name directly. He didn't think about going somewhere else. "Why did you pay for us?" she asked, driving the needle through for the 7th time. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd lost consciousness. "Fenwick was at the front of the crowd," he said finally, his voice rough with pain. "I know what Fenwick's roadhouse is. That's a reason not to let him win the bidding," Lila said. "That's not a reason to spend $80. Another long silence, broken only by the fire and the wind, and the small sound of Nettie sleeping. "You had the baby pressed against you, like you were the only thing between it and everything," Cutter said. "That's all." Lila tied the final knot and cut the sinew. She pressed a clean cloth against the closed wound and held it there. Her hands were red to the wrist and shaking slightly, which she now allowed because the work was done. "You stupid man," she said quietly. "Didn't die," he said. "You could have, didn't though." She looked at him. He was pale as birch wood, the lines of his face cut deep by pain and cold, and he was watching her with those direct dark eyes, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before, something unguarded, the way a man's face looks when he has run out of the energy required to maintain the distance. "I need you to stay awake," she said. "I know. Talk to me. I'm not good at talking." "I've noticed." Try anyway, so he talked. She didn't know if it was the blood loss or the particular stripped-down honesty of 2 o'clock in the morning. But he talked more in the next hour than in all the weeks before, about the mountain and what it cost and what it gave. About the winter before last when he'd been snowed in for 6 weeks straight and had read the same 3 books. So many times he had them memorized. About a dog he'd had for 8 years and still missed in a way that surprised him. She listened. She kept pressure on the wound. She put another log on the fire. At some point, his breathing deepened into sleep. And she stayed where she was, sitting on the floor, with her back against the legs of the table and his coat over her shoulders because she was cold, and it was the only extra thing in reach. And Nettie slept in the bed, above them, and the fire in the stove, and the fire worked steadily in the stove, and outside the mountain held them all the way. Mountains, things, without tenderness, without malice, without any awareness of them at all. But inside the room, something had shifted. Something small and irreversible, the way the first crack in spring ice is small and irreversible. She felt it without knowing its name. In the morning she woke, stiff and cold, with her head against the table leg, and found that sometime in the night his hand had moved and come to rest open against the floor near her knee. Not touching, but close. Like something reaching toward a warmth it wasn't sure it was allowed to want. She left it there. She got up slowly, fed the stove, checked his wound, and went to see to Nettie. Outside, the mountain was white and enormous, and absolute in its indifference, and inside the cabin the fire was going, and a man was breathing steadily on the floor, and a child was waking with the bright animal urgency of small children who are healthy and warm and ready for the day. Lila Marsh had lost a husband, a home, a season, and $61 she'd never had in the first. She stood at the cabin window and looked out at the snow and felt, under the cold and the exhaustion and the uncertainty of everything still ahead, something she'd almost forgotten the texture of. Not safety. Not yet. But the beginning of it, the first pale edge, like light at the rim of a mountain before the sun clears the top. The kind of light that doesn't illuminate anything yet, but tells you the dark is ending. She turned back to the room. There was a fire to keep, a child to feed, a stubborn, silent, deeply foolish man who had taken a knife in the ribs for them, and was going to need broth and clean dressings, and someone to make sure he didn't try to go check his traplandsem before the wound closed. She rolled up her sleeves. The West was not built by people who had everything they needed. It was built by people who had almost nothing, and built anyway, piece by piece, with cold hands and a long view, and the stubborn, unglamorous conviction that what was worth having was worth staying for. Lila put the pot on.